Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Beckham. I thought here I would take a look at the option that we can find in PTE-AV-Studio called Cover Screen, because we can actually find it in 3 different places. As you can see here, I've got a few images just for demo purposes. I'm just going to select the first one and I'm going to go to my styles and themes, but particularly to the styles. And when we go to the image menu, we'll find that we've got an option that says Cover Screen. Now, if I open up the same image into the Objects and Animation screen, and I go to the Properties tab at the top, and down to the Fit mode here, we've got the opportunity to cover the screen with this image here too. But of course, we can always do it manually by clicking and dragging. But there's actually a third option too. If I close this and we go down to our project options, if you know you want to do this before you start making your slideshow, you could consider this option. Because if I go to the Defaults tab here, I've got a little box that says Cover the Screen. Well, it doesn't say the screen, but that's what it amounts to. If I've already started a show, then I'm going to need to click the button to apply to all slides. But if this is something you find yourself doing quite often, as long as you tick that box and click OK, the next time you drag different sized images down into the slide list, they'll all be made to fit the screen. What in actual fact are we talking about when we say fit the screen? We're really talking primarily about the aspect ratio of the slideshow we're about to make, and to some degree the size, but the aspect ratio I think is the most important factor. If I were to go to the top left of the screen and we were to start a new project by going to File, New, you can see that the aspect ratio that comes up by default is 16:9. Now that's the perfect aspect ratio for practically all the screens we're going to view our audio visual on. Now it wasn't too long ago that when we started to make a new audio visual presentation, one of the first things we may have done is to take all of the images into our image editor and crop them to a more suitable size. But now we can publish our show to an MP4 video. There's much less need to do that, if at all. Now I don't think there's a great deal of doubt that when we begin to put together an audio visual sequence, we're going to be trying to keep all of the images the same size, because there's no doubt that when we do that, the visual appeal of our slideshow is going to be much greater. But at the same time, many of us are producing audiovisual sequences at 16:9 aspect ratio, but the vast majority of the images we wish to use are going to be from a digital SLR, and they could be 3:2 aspect ratio. And that's before we start to consider images that may be cropped while we're producing them. Now we can clearly see an example of that with the few images I've dropped into the slide list here. The first one we can see in the mini player above. I've already increased the size of that, but here's another that's probably closer to 3:2 aspect ratio. Here's one that was taken from another folder, and it looks to me as though this one was originally created at 16:9. This one was cropped into a much more letterbox shape. This one is similar, but the black bars left and right not quite as thick as the flowers. Well, I think you get the idea as I scroll through all of these images. So what we may wish to do is to make every single one of these cover the screen. Let's look at all 3 ways to do this and just talk about maybe some of the pros and cons of doing so. Now with the spinning round of the screen, what I've done here is to set up a File New. I've dragged all of the images just as they were before down into the slide list, but I've also added a piece of music and I've synchronized most of these slides. So if you look along the slide duration, you'll see that each of them is slightly different. And if you look at the transition length, you'll find some differences there too. Now, if I take you down to the timeline, you'll be able to see it slightly differently because we can see the fades. There we can see a fade which is greater than this one. This one's greater than this one, and we can easily see the difference in slide duration between the images. But what I'd also like to do is to just get you to listen just to a few of these, because if we're going to synchronize a slideshow to our music, and then we decide to use the styles to cover the screen, we may find a bit of a problem. So what I'm going to do at this point is to just go to my mini player, press play, and we'll just watch the first 4 of these images. So those few images were nicely synchronized to the music. But of course, what I'm trying to point out here is we could have a 30 or 40 slide sequence where we've spent quite a considerable amount of time doing that. We're also reminded that when images are all different formats, as these first 4 images are, they don't look very attractive to the eye when they appear on screen, even when we're looking at them in the mini player. So at this stage, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think about going to our styles and themes and applying that slide style to all of these images so they all cover the screen. Okay, let's take a look at what happens when we do that. I'm going to hit Ctrl A to select them all, then down to Styles and Themes, into the Styles option and the Image menu, and I'm going to double click the Image Cover Screen option. And you'll notice exactly what's been done to all of the images. They've all been virtually returned to their default values, so the entire synchronization and all the work we've done would have been lost. Of course, I can hit Ctrl Z if I notice that straight away. So why has this happened? Now let's take another look at the images in the slide list and this particular seascape in particular. If we look at the slide duration that we created to synchronize it with the music, we have a slide duration of 12 seconds. So with just that one image highlighted, I'm going to go down to my styles and themes and we'll have a closer look. Because when we look at this option and then we look at the parameters down here, we can see exactly what's going to be set. The full duration is going to be reduced from the 12 we can see below to 7, and that's enough to upset the synchronization. Now we could change this, we've got the opportunity to change it here, but of course each of our images are going to be slightly different. So rather than using this technique to cover the screen, we're actually going to create more work than if we did it all manually. So if we're going to use a slide style to cover screen, the time to do it is when we drag all of the images down into the slide list, and then we're ready to go. Then we can apply the cover screen before we start to synchronize the images to music. Now, many users of PTE-AV-Studio have fallen into the trap of applying a slide style and upsetting some of the work they've done. It's something that happens to us all from time to time. As you can see here, I've reset the screen. I've gone back to File New because we're going to take a look at another option. If you're going to be using images of all different formats quite often, then perhaps you should think about going to your project options, go to your Defaults tab and tick the box and click OK. Now we're going to notice quite a difference when we select these images from the file list here into the slide list below. I'll start at the top. We can click and drag these down into the slide list, but a double click does the same thing. There we are, it's covering the screen. The same with this one and all of the others. So that could be a very useful option. Now, as an example, let me go back to this image here and we'll open this up in the Objects and Animation screen. Two things to say here. The first thing is the cover screen option isn't permanent. We can go into any image and we can make a change. The second thing is, with an image like this, which was already created in a letterbox sort of style, we're going to lose quite a bit of the image on the left-hand side. So even if we're going to use the automatic setting for cover screen, we may want to come into the Objects and Animation screen for some images, and this is a good example. And we would need to go to the Animation tab, because what we could do here is use the pan, click and drag over the X, to reposition the image, so visually it looks a little better in our slideshow. Now, with the change on screen, what I've done here is to bring you back to the slideshow we was using just a few moments ago, when we demonstrated the cover screen option in the slide styles and the problems it may create for us. Well, supposing we do forget and we get part way through the production of our audio visual and then we decide we need to cover the screen. I'm going to hit Ctrl A here to select all of these. Now I'm going to go to my project options once again and back into the defaults again, and I'm going to tick the box. But of course, by ticking the box, it's not going to do anything to the images that are already in the slide list. What I'd need to do is to click Apply to all slides and then OK. So now we get all of the images covering the screen, but the transitions and the slide styles have not been affected. Now, probably the least effective way to cover the screen is in the Objects and Animation screen where we are now. If we've got an image open here, if we go to the Properties tab and down to the Fit mode, we can choose the option here. Here, of course, we can only do this one image at a time. I suppose it would be useful if we neglected to change all of the images and we had one or two to fit to the screen. But we could equally argue, if I quickly undo that if we open an image up into the Animation tab, probably a quicker way to do it will be to just click and drag on one of the toggles and we can fill the screen that way. Now, just for a moment, I'm going to double click on the X or the Y here to reset this image back. Now, we've looked at all of the options to cover the screen, but while we're dealing with this subject, maybe there's a couple of other topics we might want to touch on. To do that, I'd like to close the Objects and Animation, and I'd like to select a different image, this one here. This image, if you look to the left and below, has been cropped to a 16:9 aspect ratio, and the pixel size is 1920/1080, which means this image has been created exactly the same size as the slideshow we're creating. So with that selected, if I go to the Objects and Animation screen, and if I were to go up to my zoom options, we can see the zoom is shown to us at 100%, and here it's pretty accurate because what we're seeing here is the slideshow size, the screen size, and the image size, which are all identical. If I put my cursor over the X here, I can right click and I can ask to see the image at its original size. When I do that, nothing's going to happen here. There's going to be no change in the size of the image, simply because it's already 100%. So if I wanted to zoom this image, as an example, I would have to make the image bigger than it was designed to be viewed at. So really, I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing here. I'll double click the X. What I should be doing is going into my image editor and producing an image with more pixels, which would allow the zoom to take place. But if I close the Objects and Animation screen and I go back to our original image and open the Objects and Animation screen with that one, we're going to see a completely different thing. Because this image was never cropped to either fit the screen or to reduce the resolution to 1920 or 1080, when I right click over the Zoom X or the Zoom Y and choose Original, the image jumps to the original size, so I know that is the maximum amount of zoom that I can give it, which is quite considerable, because if I put a new keyframe in here and I turn my zoom on and reset it, even if I reset it back to that point, you're going to get a good idea that the zoom here is rather a lot, which means the zoom is quite fast on the screen. But this is a good technique to discover just how much size you have in an image, because it's not unusual when we're working on a slideshow to get to an image like this, to decide that we may want to animate it and not entirely be sure how much size we've got. Well, here's a good way of telling. We just go to that first keyframe, I can double click and it'll go back, but if I right click over the X, I can see the image at its original size. If I wanted to go bigger than that, once again, I'd need more pixels. Now let's take this image, which I have opened up into the Objects and Animation screen, which I know is 3:2 aspect ratio. It's direct from my camera and it hasn't been cropped. So if we wanted to fit the image to the screen, whether we do it manually like I've just done or whether we use one of the other options, we're going to lose a bit from the top and a bit from the bottom of the image. We do have the opportunity, of course, using the Pan Y to maneuver the image down and use the top part or the bottom part if that was the important part. But there is another way. I'm going to reset these for the moment. What we can do is to stretch the image. Now we can't do this with all images, but there are some where it works quite well. There's a couple of ways to do exactly the same thing. Let's take the more logical way first. Let's go to the zoom and we get a little chain link here. If we click that, it's broken. What that means is I can change the height and the width of this image independently, which means if I go to my Y control here and click and drag, I can move it up and down, and I can double click to reset. If I go to the X, I can actually stretch the image. Now with a landscape and a seascape, we can often get away with doing something like this, and in actual fact, I would argue in many cases it's the right thing to do. But at any time, if it doesn't work, just double click and reset, and we can join up that chain link by clicking it once again. The other way to do this is just a bit of a shortcut way really. I've just hit the spacebar key there by mistake, but all I wanted to do was to just say if we hold the Shift key and move our cursor over the toggles left and right, we can just do exactly the same thing. It has exactly the same effect, but it doesn't actually break the chain link. It does give us a little bit of a problem if we changed our mind and we double clicked, because now we're not getting the image coming back quite right. But we can just break the chain, double click the wire and reconnect the chain again. So holding the shift key we can click and drag. So in many cases we can make a landscape fit without using fit to screen, so we're not losing any of the top or the bottom. To bring this video to a close, I've brought us back to the slide list and I've highlighted the image we looked at before. I'm straying just a little off topic here, but I no longer create executable files as my published option. I always now create high quality MP4 videos. Now we know this image has been created at exactly the same size as the slideshow we're creating, 1920 by 1080. But if we move to the image just to the left of it, which is a new one I've inserted into the timeline, if you look just below the thumbnail, you're going to see we're working on a huge file here from a Canon 5D Mark IV, a 30 megapixel camera. So the pixel value is 8000 by more or less 5400. In recent times, many users of this software would have taken all of the images like this into Photoshop or Lightroom, and they would have reduced the size. But if we publish our show to an MP4 video, that isn't necessary. Now I think I can demonstrate best why this is if we were to go up to the extreme top right and choose to publish this show. I'm going to choose HD and 4K video, but on this occasion you can see the default is 1920 1080. So the output of the final video is going to be controlled by this here. So effectively, as we create the MP4, then the final size of our video is going to be 1920 1080, and so will all of the pictures within it, making allowance of course for those that we've panned and zoomed. And if we use the 60p, then we get very smooth transitions and we get smooth animation too. Now let me close down this particular window and we'll move across to the file list on the left. There you can see an MP4 video which I've made from the images you can see in the slide list here. So if I right click that video and we just take a look at the file info, there we can see the deciding factor of the slideshow we're about to create is going to be the frame size, 1920 by 1080, or 4K if that was your choice. I'll see you next time.